What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, we've talked about some powerful mutants, right? Like Matthew Malloy. All right, Matthew Malloy, in our discussions about powerful mutants, all right, Matthew Malloy was like, okay, the most powerful mutant that we'd ever talked about on my channel. I mean, there was like Franklin Richards and Mad Jim Jaspers, and there were some crazy powerful mutants. Man, let me tell you something. Dude, this guy, the Marquis of Death, there's beyond Omega level mutant, and like, then there's this guy. I mean, this dude, it's stupid how powerful this guy is. And that's a crazy thing. I'd never heard of him until like 3 or 4 days ago. And like somebody commented in one of my videos and they were like, hey, would you do something about the Marquis of Death? And I'm like, who the hell's the Marquis of Death? And so like, I just started poking around online and I was like, Jesus, this guy. All right, so here's the deal. The Marquis of Death is a dude named Clyde Wincham Jr. And his whole origin actually came out of a 2008 story called Marvel 1985. Now here's the deal. For those of you guys who are new to Marvel Comics, there's what's called original graphic novels. Original graphic novels are basically just stories in comic books, and they don't have any one particular place that they fit into. It's just a story out there somewhere. The Dark Knight Returns is an example of an original graphic novel. It's just a story that takes place somewhere along the line, but it doesn't really fit into any existing continuity. Marvel 1985 was an original graphic novel in so much that it was 6 parts, but it might as well have just been an original graphic novel. I mean, they released it as a singular trade or something like that, but it's basically just a story that just kind of takes place out there in the middle of nowhere, and there's no actual timeline that's specified to it, which means that like none of the Marvel characters reference it later on, so it's just kind of out in the middle of no man's land. But the fact remains, Marvel 1985 is a story that's largely told from the perspective of a kid named Toby. And Toby is this kid who's just kind of hanging out. And the whole story takes place in Earth 1218, which is the real world. That's the world that we're in right now, where you're watching this video and I'm making this video and all that kind of good stuff. The whole idea is that Toby's just this kid who's like hanging out. And there's this place called the Wincham House. And the idea is that no one goes to the Wincham House. It's considered to be haunted / cursed / nobody goes there. You know, Toby's dad, Jerry, is like, don't go there, you know, stay away from the Wincham House. Well, eventually Toby goes by there one day and sees like the Red Skull. And he's like, what in the heck? Because in the real world, he reads comic books. And so he's like, the Red Skull's a fictional comic book character. This is weird. And so as more time progresses, these villains from the Marvel universe start cropping up. It's like Vulture, and it's like, you know, Doctor Doom, and so on and so forth. And so the whole idea is that it leads to Toby kind of trying to figure out what's going on. But eventually Toby discovers this portal, because by this point in the story, by the time Toby discovers this portal, things have gone awry. Like Galactus has shown up in the real world and is gonna like consume the Earth. So it's just like, okay, we've got to do something. So Toby finds this dimensional portal, he walks through and ends up in the Marvel universe, in the main Marvel universe, and then he goes to see the Avengers and he gets run off. They're like, whatever, get out of here. So he goes to see the Fantastic Four, and it's like, wait in line, because there's a ton of people waiting on the Fantastic Four. So eventually he discovers Spider-Man. And it's really kind of cool, because as a person who read Spider-Man comics in the real world, Toby knows everything about Peter Parker. And so he basically kind of, confronts Peter Parker, says, hey, look, I know everything about you and all that kind of good stuff. And then we don't really see what happens. Instead, we end up picking back in the real world, and we actually end up joining up with Jerry. And what we find out is that when Jerry was a little kid, he was friends with this kid named Clyde. And the idea was that somewhere along the line, and no one really knows how, but somewhere along the line, Clyde's house just like vanished one day. It was just gone, disappeared, and then it reappeared. And there was no indication anybody knew what was going on. There was no indication that like Clyde or his mom had any idea what happened or anything along those lines. And so, Clyde and Jerry continued to hang out and that kind of thing. Well, eventually what happens is like one day, everybody in town just like goes into this hypnotic state, and they all just start descending on the Wincham house. Well, then like Clyde Wincham's like deceased dad, his dead dad, gets resurrected from the dead and shows up on their front door. And so it's like, what in the heck is going on? And so like Clyde's mom starts freaking out and she starts blaming Jerry. And then Clyde speaks up. He's like, look, I have these powers to control reality, but I don't know how to use them. His mom freaks out, hits him over the head with a candlestick, and sends him into a catatonic state. And so everything just kind of goes back to normal. Well, then we fast forward 20 years in 2008 when the story was written, and we end up finding out that Clyde was taken to an insane asylum. But when he was taken there, he wasn't allowed to bring his comics. And so the result was that, he had basically reached into the main Marvel universe and grabbed all these different villains and then brought them over into the real world. And it was just designed for the purpose of showing everybody like, hey, you have to do what I tell you to, that kind kind of a thing. This is the kind of power I possess. So Jerry and his guys, end up grabbing the comic books of Clyde and they end up bringing them over. At the same time, Toby shows back up with like the Avengers and the Fantastic Four and the X-Men, like all these different superheroes from the main Marvel universe. And so it's like this massive battle between like all the villains and all the superheroes. So Jerry goes over to the insane asylum where Clyde's at and is like, hey, look, here's all your comic books. I'm sorry they took them away from you. Here's your comic books back. And then Jerry pleads with Clyde to like set things back to normal. Well, before Clyde can do it, the Red Skull shows up and kills Jerry. And so Clyde's just like, enough. Like he freaks out. Like he's just like, enough. Everybody go back. And he ends up like sending all the supervillains back to the main Marvel universe. Well, then Captain America's like, hey, look, man, that was kind of crazy. Look, in my universe, we have people like you all over the place that have like brain damage. And, we have people like Reed Richards and so on and so forth. And they can help you. They can, return you to some state of normalcy. Now, that's where the story ends. But if you thought that was crazy, wait, man, wait until you get what we're getting ready to get into. Switch over to Mark Millar's Fantastic Four. Technically, it's issues 562 to 569, but really it's issues 564 to 569. And the reason why is because of the fact that it's a story called The Master of Doom or something along those lines. But the idea is that it picks up in the point in the Fantastic Four's history prior to Dark Reign, when Dr. Doom is basically arrested for all the villainous acts that he had ever done, and he's just put on trial for crimes against humanity. Now, being part of Norman Osborn's whole cabal and all that kind of good stuff, he's basically exonerated and allowed to go free, and it eventually goes back to Latveria. But when Reed Richards showed up to him and said, hey, look, man, like, I just want to talk, eventually, Doom kind of plays some mind games, whatever, Reed begins to walk off. But then Doom makes reference to something about the master that taught him everything. And so that's when it's just kind of like, what? Like what in the world is going on? And it's really kind of weird because what we end up doing is we actually jump after the events of Dark Reign, which I think we covered during Hickman's Fantastic Four, but that's the point when he goes back to normal, so to speak, and when Doom is basically exonerated and that kind of a thing. But from that point going forward, the story starts to pick up with like these weird little things that crop up here and there. Like there's this body of the Watcher, of Uatu the Watcher, that just like shows up on the ocean, and it's detected by some scientist or something like that. Reed Richards goes to figure it out, goes to look at it, see what's going on, whatever, and then Doom goes back to Latveria. Well, when he gets there, we end up finding out the reason why he's throwing this huge celebration is because his master's returning. And the idea is that when his master's returning, things are getting ready to pop off. Well, there were a whole bunch of plot threads that Mark Millar was writing at the time, but once we get back to the whole idea of like the Watcher, we end up finding out that it's not the main Uatu the Watcher from the main Marvel universe, it's a version of Uatu the Watcher from a different universe. From that point, we pick up with the Marquis of Death. Now, the Marquis of Death just has like this apprentice. That's it. That's all we know. It's just like an apprentice that he has. But the Marquis of Death is in like this alternate universe. All right, this guy shows up, and it all happens off panel. We don't actually see it, but this guy shows up and just like eradicates the Earth's heroes. I mean, that's it. Like there's no contest. Like they're all just dead. They're all just killed off. Well, in this universe, it was Reed Richards and a guy named Jack Storm who became the Human Torch, and they actually ended up getting in a relationship together, ended up getting married, I think. But the crazy thing was that like Reed Richards is the one person spared alive. Well, of course, Jack Storm shows up, and as the Human Torch tries to fight back, and like the Marquis of Death just like snaps his neck, just like reaches out into the sky and just snaps his neck. I promise it gets absolutely bananas, from this point going forward. So Reed Richards, this alternate reality version of Reed Richards kind of begs and pleads, whatever. The Marquis of Death doesn't care, kills that version of Reed by ripping his heart out and then eating it. And then he just sticks his hand in the air, he forces the sun to go supernova and then sets off a chain reaction that ignites all the other stars across the cosmos and then just obliterates the universe in its entirety. Not only that, we end up finding out once he shows up in the main Marvel universe with his apprentice and meets Dr. Doom, we end up finding out that what the Marquis of Death and his apprentice had been doing was just like hopping and skipping from one universe to the next, just obliterating all the cosmic entities, like wiping out Galactus, Eternity, Infinity, Mistress Death, just like killing them all off, and then just like, destroying all these different Earths and so on and so forth. So when the Marquis of Death finally shows up to meet Dr. Doom, dude, this is the craziest thing about this. When he shows up to meet Doom, Doom's initial response is, all right, are you happy with what I've done so far, the power that I've gained and so on and so forth? And then the Marquis of Death is like, no, you're a colossal failure. Like I literally showed up 20 years ago and taught you everything that you knew about like magic and mysticism. I gave you all the tools that you needed to make yourself God, and you've been routinely defeated by the Fantastic Four. And so the result is that the Marquis of Death like sets him on fire and tries to kill him. Now, the cool thing about this is that like Doom fights back. Like Doom ends up, just kind of like flipping out, losing his mind and attacking the Marquis of Death. And so it leads to like this 6-week-long battle, like this 6-week-long conflict that stretches on and on and on. Initially, it was just Dr. Doom and the Marquis of Death. And then it's all the other superheroes across the earth that end up joining in. So the X-Men, the Fantastic Four, Excalibur, all these different superheroes that end up joining in, and even some supervillains that join the side of Dr. Doom in trying to defeat the Marquis of Death. So the Marquis of Death is defeated, Reed Richards sacrifices his life, Dr. Doom marries Susan Storm, and then like they're expecting a kid. And so what we found out was that the Apprentice and the Marquis of Death were defeated by Dr. Doom when he locked them away in something called the Omega Box. Now we're not really given any information on what the Omega Box is. It's just this box that's designed to contain them. But it's this really cool moment because it's like under Dr. Doom, the world had experienced this whole new era of peace and prosperity and all that kind of stuff. And it was just like this great scientific age. Well, Susan Storm is just kind of like, hey, are you finally happy? And Doom's like, yes. And then she reveals herself to be the Apprentice, and like the Marquis of Death steps out of the Omega Box. Not only that, we end up finding out that this was not like some 6-week-long battle. It's been less than 5 seconds. All right. Not only that, all right, this is where it gets crazy. The Marquis of Death, all right, not only did he like distort reality and screw up Dr. Doom's mind to make him believe 6 weeks had passed, all right, he grabs Dr. Doom, he turns his heart to stone, turns his blood to acid, opens up a time portal, and throws him 65 million years into the past. I've never seen anything like that before. The only time I ever saw anything like that was during the Infinity Gauntlet story, and that was Thanos wielding the Infinity Stones. So the Marquis of Death is like, okay, look, like if Dr. Doom was not able to beat the Fantastic Four, then I'm gonna be the one to defeat them, and then I'm gonna kill him. Because I mean, you gotta think about it from his perspective, right? Like he's been traveling around these different universes, killing all these different superheroes. For him, it's nothing to kill the Fantastic Four. So the Marquis of Death's first stop is to basically meet and like torment and torture Ben Grimm. And so when he shows up, he basically makes Ben Grimm witness the death of his Aunt Petunia. Not only that, he also turns around to the other Fantastic Four and basically says, I killed Victor Von Doom. I threw him into the past. I turned his blood to acid, turned his heart to stone, all that kind of good stuff. And when the Fantastic Four try to fight back, he just starts like manipulating reality around them. Like he basically turns Susan Storm's, her force fields and so on and so forth, turns them against her. So it basically just kind of shuts her down and almost puts her in a catatonic state. He makes Johnny Storm witness all the different times that the Marquis of Death has killed Susan Storm. I mean, it's absolutely bonkers because he's just distorting reality in this extreme way. So eventually he grabs Reed Richards and just like takes off. Like he literally grabs him and just whisks him away to the other side of the universe. And then they start reality hopping. The first thing he does is he takes him back to his own past. He takes him to the point when the Fantastic Four first gain their powers and says, look, I will go ahead and I will leave your universe alone and I'll stop wiping out all these different universes if you kill Ben Grimm. Because Ben Grimm wishes he could die. Instead of becoming the Thing, he wishes he could be dead, and Reed ultimately says, no, I'm not going to do that. He's better off alive than he is dead, so on and so forth. And so then he's like, okay, well, what about your son, Franklin Richards? He's got these godlike powers. He doesn't know how to control them, so on and so forth. I'll kill him. And, I'll go ahead and kill him for you. And again, I'll spare, the multiverse, basically. Reed again turns him down. And so finally, we get this origin story for the Marquis of Death. And what this does is it picks up after the Marvel 1985 story. And what we find out is that this, version of Clyde Wincham had basically been put in a machine by Reed Richards that was designed to keep him in a state of suspended animation, to keep him in a catatonic state, but he would experience nothing but like these incredible dreams and so on and so forth. Well, various villains, again, this is an alternate reality, but various villains had shown up, like all of Reed Richards' villains had shown up and attacked Clyde Wincham. Well, then Clyde Wincham emerged from this containment unit or whatever you want to call it, and then had total control of his faculties. The dude waved his hand and all the villains were dead. Just like waved his hand. I mean, it wasn't like some grandiose conflict or battle. He just waved his hand and they all died. The molecule man, Owen Reese, was just one of the people who were killed by the Marquis of Death. That's how powerful this guy is. The molecule man, Owen Reese, is a guy that can manipulate matter on a multiversal scale. He's a multiversal threat. Before his powers were reduced, he was more powerful than the living tribunal. That's how powerful the molecule man, Owen Reese, was. The Marquis of Death just waves his hand and the molecule man is dead. Now, it does beg questions. Was this molecule man, was his powers unlocked? Was he as powerful as his main Earth 616 self? We don't know. We're not given an answer to that question. But, the Marquis of Death says, look, this is me in the past. You could kill this version of me and I will never become who I am right now. But ultimately Reed says, no, I'm not going to do that. Well, we end up finding out that all these different alternate reality versions of Mr. Fantastic, that is to say, the member of the Fantastic Four who could stretch, were all told by the Marquis of Death, I'm destroying your realities because there will come a point when I will ask Reed Richards from the main Marvel Universe if he would kill his son or his friend or even me at a younger state in order to spare all your universes, and he's going to say no, i.e. Reed Richards is the reason why all their universes were obliterated or why all the superheroes on their Earths were destroyed. And so the result is that Reed Richards ends up having, like the Fantastic Four, have to go against all these alternate reality versions of Reed Richards. Like, you know, whether it's Ben Grimm who becomes Mr. Fantastic or Johnny Storm who becomes Mr. Fantastic or Susan Storm who becomes Mrs. Fantastic, whatever, you know, they all end up descending on the Baxter Building for the purpose of just unleashing absolute hell. Well, then Ben Grimm starts to overhear what it is that's going on in the middle of this whole conflict and realizes that this is basically Clyde Wincham from, you know, Area 87, you know, the place that Reed Richards had previously visited where he kept Clyde Wincham's head in this state of suspended animation. Well, Ben Grimm races off and grabs Clyde Wincham and brings him back. Now, this past version of Clyde Wincham is nowhere near as powerful as the Marquis of Death, but he's powerful enough that when the two of them end up doing battle, it weakens the Marquis of Death. But notice this, all right, notice this. When the two of them are having their conversation and the Marquis of Death is talking about all the things that he's done, he talks about creating these constructs that were just more powerful than Galactus. Imagine that, like a being so powerful that they just created constructs that were more powerful than Galactus, and it made Galactus look like absolutely nothing. I mean, it's crazy the kind of things that he could do. And so the Marquis of Death starts talking about how he was going through and just obliterating all the cosmic entities, that it was child's play. And so the result is that when the two of them end up going into battle with one another, while the Marquis of Death isn't really killed by Clyde Wincham, the result is that, you know, the Marquis of Death is just severely weakened by the attack. And so the result is that we end up learning that the apprentice that the Marquis of Death has been walking around with the entire time is Doctor Doom. And it's crazy because what we end up finding out is that when Doctor Doom was thrown into the past, where he was torn apart by all these different, you know, dinosaurs and so on and so forth, these sharks, that he used magic to basically either regrow his limbs or at the very least to keep himself alive. And then from there, he spent the next however many millions of years just like walking the earth and learning all these different forms of magic. Now, the death of this alternate reality version of the Watcher was the result of the fact that that Watcher saw what was going on with Doctor Doom. So Doctor Doom just killed him so he wouldn't have to worry about it. But then the Marquis of Death encountered this guy somewhere along the line. But by that point, Doctor Doom had basically changed his appearance in such an extreme way, even down to the molecular level, the Marquis of Death didn't realize it was Doctor Doom. And so the result was that the Marquis of Death was walking around with the very man that he would kill later on in the future without ever having realized it. And so Doctor Doom basically overpowers the Marquis of Death, who's extremely weak at this point, totally incinerates him, and then just tells the Fantastic Four, I'm going back to Latveria. If you end up starting stuff, I'm going to obliterate all of you. So again, it's a pretty quick ending to the story. I mean, it's really the only way you can end it. I mean, when you're talking about a character with power that extreme, there's only so much you can do. But this guy, so this begs the question, how powerful is the Marquis of Death in relation to other characters that we've talked about? Well, we know just by virtue of his actions and going through and killing the cosmic entities, the Marquis of Death is more powerful than the Molecule Man, Owen Reese. He's more powerful than the Beyonder, because the Beyonder is just as powerful as the Molecule Man, Owen Reese. The Marquis of Death is more powerful than Franklin Richards. The Marquis of Death is more powerful than Matthew Malloy. I would go as far as to say the Marquis of Death might even be more powerful than the Living Tribunal. Now that begs the question, why didn't the Living Tribunal intervene? No idea. Probably just for the sake of the story, and it would have been easier just to not have him in there. Maybe Mark Miller forgot about him. I have no idea. But given everything that we've seen in terms of the power that the Marquis of Death has displayed, just kind of walking around space and time and so on and so forth, the idea that after he had killed all the supervillains, he spent 1 billion years learning how to manipulate all space and time and control his reality warping powers, I would say the Marquis of Death is probably more powerful than the Living Tribunal, but less powerful than the One Above All. So it may very well be that the Marquis of Death is the most powerful being in the multiverse, or at least was before he died, second only to, you know, the One Above All itself. I mean, that's the only way I know how to class. I can't classify power like this. I can't explain power like this. I had to read this comic 3 times in order to be able to grasp what it was that I was seeing. It's crazy. This kind of thing is absolutely bananas, but this guy is so wildly powerful. It's the most powerful mutant that I think has ever existed in the history of Marvel Comics. Even adult Franklin Richards that made Galactus's Herald, he was nowhere near that level. I mean, as powerful as he was, making Galactus's Herald, you know, he still wasn't able to defeat the Celestials by himself, so it means that he was on par with Celestials, but this guy, the Marquis of Death, was way beyond the Celestials, way beyond the cosmic entities. I mean, it's just, it's nuts. It's bonkers. It's one of the craziest things ever. So yeah, as far far as I'm aware, unless we end up discovering something new, this guy, the Marquis of Death, is definitively the most powerful mutant that's ever existed in the history of Marvel Comics. It's crazy. Anyway, guys, we're gonna go ahead and bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.